Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. On this day in 1535, Thomas More was taken from his cell in the Tower of London to his execution. He spent his final months on earth writing extensively, especially on the topic of death. One of his works is called The Utopia. We look at his advice for living and dying well with Stephen Smith. Stephen is the Temple Family Chair of English Literature at Hillsdale College. He teaches Renaissance literature with a focus on the works of Thomas More, William Shakespeare, and John Milton. Stephen, it's so great to speak with you. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you. It's great to be on your show.
Well, it's great to speak with you. I want to begin by asking you to share with us why Thomas More's writings deserve attention and what is the undying quality of his works.
Well, I think anyone who encounters this saint directly, especially in his writings, is going to be moved to wonder over his mind, his wit, his wisdom, his eloquence. And of course, when you study the events of his life, his character. So it's an incredible opportunity for listeners and readers, to get to know Thomas More better. It changed my life as a young man running into St. Thomas More and beginning to study him many years ago now. And so with the new book, The Last Riddle, the idea is to allow readers to follow More, the footsteps of his life, of his mind, through these beautiful letters and prayers that he wrote in the Tower of London. So you can begin right on the morning of his arrest and follow him to Tower Hill, the anniversary of which is today, July the 6th.
He was a friend of Erasmus of Rotterdam. Tell us about who he was, for our listeners who might not be too acquainted with him. Who was he? What did he stand for? And why do we remember him in his Christian witness?
Well, Thomas More was the great leading citizen of his country. He was born in 1478, died in 1535. He was born in London. He was mentored at court, educated at Oxford. He studied law in London. He held so many offices. He served in Parliament. He was the Under-Sheriff of London, Speaker of the House, Lord Chancellor of England. And as you mentioned at the beginning, he's a famous author and an eloquent one. He's known for the integrity of his life, his whole approach to living. And that shines through in the writings and, of course, in his biography as well. So I would put integrity there at the top of the list. That real, consistency of mind and heart, the consistency of our whole lives. That was his, I think his real glory. And the witness of his integrity under tremendous pressure and in the middle of tremendous storms is just so instructive to us now.
One of the things I greatly appreciated about your book, by the way, the book is called The Last Riddle Advice on Living and Dying Well from the Imprisoned Saint Thomas More. One of the things I appreciated about your book, Stephen, is that you tried to get us not just in the mind of Thomas More, but also in his heart and his sentiment. For example, when you talk about April of 1534 and him being summoned to Lambeth, just reading that section made me feel, if you will, the pit in the stomach that he must have felt, knowing what was awaiting him.
Yes, he's the most, our saints are wonderful in the church. He's one of the most human of the saints. And one of the things that stands out to me from the letters and the prayers is his mind, yes, his wisdom and his counsel, but also his heart and his frankness when it comes to emotion as well. And I think that pit you felt, he would have been crazy not to have experienced some kind of, something like the siege of fear, the emotion of fear. And he writes extensively about that emotion in the Tower of London and how to govern ourselves, when it besieges us or when it's used against us. And so the humanity of Thomas More really shines out of these letters too. on his heart. One of the other big themes in the book is friendship. You mentioned Erasmus earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Erasmus, his lifelong friend, said that Thomas More was born for friendship, and that if you wanted just a great example of true friendship in action, how to make friends, how to grow friendships, the arts of friendship, you'd find it nowhere to better purpose than in Thomas More. So friendship also shines out of the Tower of London. It's an extraordinary, I think, testimony to anyone who takes the time to read the letters, read the prayers, and to really take them to heart.
As we read the letters themselves, you get the sense from essentially the first few pages of the Tower Letters that he has embraced the potential of an impending death. He doesn't pretend that this is definitely where he's leading until you sort of get deeper into it, and you get a sense that he seems to see it. But he knew going in that a public execution might await him. Share with us his thought process and how the fortitude, but also the humanity with which he approached that.
Yes, he was very well prepared for the Tower of London. In a sense, he had spent his whole life preparing for the trial of his lifetime there in the last 15 months. But we know from one of the letters that before he was summoned and arrested and imprisoned, he had thought, while everybody else was sleeping at home, he had paced the halls of his home in Chelsea, thinking about the very worst that could befall him in this business. And the very worst in this case wasn't just beheading. It was drawing and quartering, just a hideous fate. So he had not only studied all the issues at play in the legal problems at the end of his life, but he had prepared himself for threats, for terrors, for fear. I mean, who wants to get, decapitated? Who would want to be drawn and quartered? And it's grisly. But he tells us in this letter he had actually really thought it out. What's the worst this can come to? And then how will I lead myself if it comes to that? And how will I lead others? So he was really remarkably prepared for that, and yet he also lets us see the difficulties of it, the real strain of it. He lets us see his frailty at times in the letters, in addition to his good humor and his hope and his fortitude. So you really, through these letters and prayers in the Last Riddle, you have a chance to get as close to him as almost as you can get. I've been studying him for a long time, and I just love these letters and prayers. I mean, they're the direct path to the best of his mind and heart. And if anyone's wondering what the Last Riddle means, the title, when More was in the Tower, he told his daughter he was living out a riddle, the case of a man who could lose his head and have no harm, but instead of harm, blessing at the hand of God. So now his family did not entirely appreciate this. There was this kind of humor in it. But that is how he put it. I'm living out this last riddle, how you could be decapitated and have no harm, but instead of harm, blessing. So that's the origin of the title.
Listening to you share that, but also just reading through the book, you come to a very clear sense that this is a man who was human. He truly was. His fortitude came from a well-exercised reason. We're talking with Stephen Smith. Stephen is the author of The Last Riddle, Advice on Living and Dying Well, from the Imprisoned Saint Thomas More. This is published by Word on Fire Press, and we're talking really about Saint Thomas More, whose life ended today by execution. This is the anniversary, and we're going to dive deeper into his thoughts before his death. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome Welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I'm talking with Stephen Smith about Thomas More's advice on dying well. Stephen, to pick up where we left off, one of the things that comes across in reading his letters very clearly is that this is a man who spent all of his life expanding and training his reason rightly, so that, coupled with his faith, he encountered every civic, social, political, practical issue with the bearing of reason and the illumination of faith. And that's what compelled him to take the stance he did.
Yes, from his earliest writings, and one thing that listeners should really take to heart and remember is Thomas More is the first major author of the English Renaissance. You mentioned Utopia. Mm-hmm. He's also the author of Richard III and a bunch of Latin poetry and dialogues and biography and all sorts of works. And one thing that unites those beautiful writings is this commitment to exercising reason and good judgment in the reader. And he really wants to help the reader, bring reason to bear on our own natures and on life, so that it actually helps us weather the storms, live well, lead ourselves well. And I think with his writings in mind, they're very often aimed at exercising the wit, the judgment, the reason of the reader. He even says in one of his great earlier dialogues that great literature furnishes you with something you need more than almost anything else in life, a good mother wit. And so he, that commitment to reason and to really training, exercising the mind, the intelligence, the wit, the reason, is really at the heart of St. Thomas More's own writings. He's very committed to that and wants readers to strengthen their wit, strengthen their reason, so that it can serve them in all the demands of their lives.
One of the ways in which we see this very clearly is the swearing of the oath. Share with us what was this oath that Thomas More refused to undertake and how masterfully he framed his position to the very end.
Yes, with the oath, we often jump to the end of the story, the oath of supremacy, swear that Henry is the head of the church in England, but it started with what's called the oath of the Act of Succession, and More would not swear that either, and that's how it started. And in both cases, the oath involved swearing that, in the case of the first oath, the oath seems to have implied that the marriage to Anne Boleyn was lawful, but also the supremacy of the king over the church. And so More in conscience would not swear to that. And that began an intensifying campaign against him to, really force the issue to its crisis, which finally happened, 15 months later at his public trial. But really, there's so much at play in the More story. There is the king's marriage, but there's also the king's new laws. Mm-hmm. And, one of the best readers of More that I know is deeply convinced, and I think rightly so, that St. Thomas More died for a witness to many things, but one of them in particular was the rule of law and good law. And so Henry's, machinations and the machinations of his ministers, on the other hand, tyrannical and illegal. So the oath became, the crisis point. Swear it, don't swear it. When he was first interrogated, the authorities even put on a little play for him where he was commanded to go into a space and watch other men go into the room, swear the oath and come out relieved and happy and enjoying the friendship of the powerful. And then another poor guy who goes in and refuses it and gets, sent straight to the Tower of London. So it was a real showdown between a statesman and I think tyranny.
And that showdown found, in this case, the arena of the battle in Thomas More's conscience. Can you please speak to how Thomas More's very public witness to his conscience's position, how that impacted his compatriots, those who would compel him to sign the oath for friendship's sake, and how it also witnessed to the king, who himself was betraying what he knew to be objectively true in conscience?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that Thomas More, it could be seen as a lonely stand, right? I mean, not many stood with him, but that stand of conscience he described as being peaceful, clear, and joyful, and I think it really was a service to everyone you just mentioned. I mean, to his own family and friends, to his enemies, who he prayed for, both in his personal prayers and at the trial at the end of his life, and of course for the king himself. I mean, the king and More, they went way back. There was something like a friendship between them, and I've often thought several things about the end of the story. But what did Henry VIII think when More's last words were reported back to him? What did he? How might we understand the showdown in terms of friendship also? Because More, by not budging, by not moving, by not playing along with the powerful king, it really was like love, right? I mean, I'm not going to play along with this. I'm not going to flatter you. I'm not going to bend to your will. I'm not going to make a shipwreck out of my life and how I've tried to live it and the principles with which I've guided it. So it was a no, but it was also a yes to good conscience, to integrity, to truth. And I just think it really is a service, like a light, for family, friends, enemies, king, posterity. Even as he was, apparently, with the exception of St. John Fisher and a few others, very alone in that stand.
As you mentioned him being alone, I think it's also important to highlight he had a friendship with all these people, including the king. And so he's standing against people with whom he broke bread and shared fellowship with.
Yes, and in fact, the judges who condemned him at trial, these were like, old professional friends. Mm-hmm. So it's a very painful story, but that makes More's kind of charity even more striking. And the prayers that he offers for, like, for example, the judges who are condemning him, it's a rare charity, especially when you know of all these connections between More and really everyone in the story. So the other thing I should mention is I've mentioned several times he's alone, but the other thing the book includes is all of most of the prayers that he wrote in the tower. And those beautiful prayers, they're, some of his best writings, but they show us his friendship with God. And they show us his prayer, his relationship, again, his friendship with God. So I think he would have said, I'm not alone in the tower at all.
We're going to have to pause there, Stephen. My guest is Stephen Smith, Dr. Stephen Smith. He's a professor of literature at Hillsdale College and also author of The Last Riddle Advice on Living and Dying Well from the Imprisoned Saint Thomas More. Stephen's just left us with a cliffhanger that all that More went through was a public testimony of the friendship he had with God. And that's what we're going to continue on the other side of the break. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Beat. I'm talking with Stephen Smith, author of The Last Riddle Advice on Living and Dying Well from the Imprisoned Saint Thomas More. So, Stephen, the cliffhanger, you left us realizing that in all that Thomas did, even when he was standing against the myriad of his earthly friends and professional friends, masterful at friendship as he was testifying to the greater friendship he had, which was his friendship with God.
Yes, I mean that's the fundamental loyalty, and he was loyal to the truth, and witnessed to the truth at the end of his life. And I think that's where the peace and the clarity and the strength and the joy of More comes from, is that kind of deep-rooted relationship with God. He called God his tender, loving Father earlier in his life. He wrote poems on comparing the human being to, a poem called 12 Properties of a Lover, where he established an analogy between earthly lovers and how we should love God. And he speaks throughout his career about the centrality of the love of God and cultivating that strong, deep love of God. And he did so through daily prayer. He did so through daily practices, through the sacraments. So when he writes these prayers in the tower, and when we see that side of him shining out, it's again the work of a lifetime, really coming to final flower. And we have the prayer he wrote just in the days before his death. That's in the book. I mean, these are, in my mind, these are just precious documents. And we know that, the very last things he prayed for were for friends and enemies, and he wanted to make merry together in heaven. So he ends with that kind of charity. And his very last words in the final prayer are, "Lord, give me patience in tribulation, and grace in everything to conform my will to thine, that I may truly say, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The things, good Lord, that I pray for, give me the grace to labor for. Amen." And that's another really interesting line. I mean, this is just days before his death, and he understands himself as, still having something to live for. God wants him to do something. I was talking to my wife about the book, and she made a really great point and said, I think this book is great for anyone who's in a situation of frankly, just real suffering and a moment where you might be tempted to just give up and think there's no point to this. What good could possibly come of this? And here's St. Thomas More at the end with just a few hours, a few days before decapitation, drawing and quartering, whatever it's going to be, at work, praying for the grace to do God's will in those remaining hours and to love him busily, energetically, joyfully. So it's a beautiful witness, and I just love those prayers. I should also add, if anyone listening would like the full More story, from beginning of his life to the end, the Center for Thomas More Studies, where I serve as co-director, has released a full 8-part video course on the life and writings of Thomas More. So you can get the whole story on the center's website, and the video class is called Thomas More, a Leading Citizen, and it tells his story from beginning to end, full of cliffhangers too.
I have a feeling you and I are going to be fast friends. I've tried to not share too much of my personal vested interest because this book is so beautiful, but I grew up in the British Commonwealth. I grew up raised to be a faithful servant of Her Majesty the Queen at that point, and to have this almost parental, reverential love and fear of the crown. And becoming Christian and then moving to the United States reshaped the way I think about, especially authority, let alone centralized and absolute authority. But that gave me especially becoming Catholic, that gave me a tremendous appreciation and love, even to the point of tears, of Thomas More and what he stood for and what he was willing to die for. And I want to invite you, therefore, to speak to the fact that he had the heart to say, I die the king's good servant, but God's first. Even to the very end, he didn't want to repudiate his friend and his monarch, but he needed to testify to the love he had for God above all else.
Yes, and the formulation you just used, I die the king's good servant, but God's first, is by far the best known version of his last words. But we know that there's a little tweak, and this is included in the book. Mm-hmm. The last words were, I die the king's good servant and God's first. And so, we, in Robert Bolt's Man for All Seasons, for example, and other works, go with the but the and is actually in the record that comes down to us, and that kind of suggests, I think, the truth for More, that there isn't a conflict between being the good servant of the king and the good servant of God. And in fact, his death is a last act of service. He was also really interesting. He was recalling the lesson that Henry himself had given More when More entered the royal service. The king had told More on several occasions, you look first to God, and after God unto the king. So those last words recall what Thomas More called the most virtuous lesson a king ever gave to one of his guys. And I've often wondered, was he thinking about, stirring the memory of the king or reaching the king even in those last moments? He had been commanded to be brief on the scaffold. And so, I'll give Henry some credit. Nobody with a brain would have given, Thomas More a podium for, an hour up there. But, so More chose his words, very prudently, but very unforgettably, very powerfully. And again, I think in a way that serves is loving toward his old friend, the king. And so I've just wondered, what did Henry think when those words were reported back to him? What did he remember? How did they move him? More was quite sincere at the end in his love for both his friends and the men who became the enemies of his life. So those last words are unforgettable. As my sons would say, a mic drop. So,
Yes, that would be Thomas More's final mic drop moment.
He also, I should add, he did, he loved to laugh his whole life. And another thing that comes out of the letters and the prayers is that good humor of the man. He just had this beautiful, merry manner. And that was not like a superficial sense of humor or something like that. But it was, I think, really deeply connected to his hope and also to the perspective that he had on earthly life. And so he jested on the way to the scaffold. Famous little jokes come down to us. And people who heard them remembered them and, passed them on. And some people were confused. They're like, is this guy crazy? He's making a joke on the way to decapitation? But it was that peace of soul. It was that clarity. And I think hope, too. I mean, he did die with a mysterious smile on his lips, I think.
Come now, Stephen. You cannot just drop us that fact that he made that joke on the way to the execution block and not tell us what the joke was.
Okay, well, there's a few of them. One was, he told the executioner, to help. He needed help getting up onto the scaffold, and so he said, lend me a hand. lend me a hand up there. Afterwards, I'll shift for myself. So, don't worry about after. But you got to get me up there first. And then the other one I've always loved, is the request to spare his beard, because his beard at least had not been found guilty of treason. So I think, sort of respect my beard. I kind of like that one too. But there's many, many jokes that come down to us in the record afterwards. And he was just famous for that merriment and that good humor.
So we've got about a minute and a half left in the segment. The United States of America just celebrated our semi-quincentennial, the $50 word of the week. And I want to ask you to share with us, in the spirit and love and heart of Thomas More, how we, Christians in this great republic, ought to think about our liberty and the blessings of being free citizens under God.
Yeah, the events of this past weekend should move us all to gratitude for our country and rededication to its principles and public service. I think with More, we know that he loved liberty, he loved friendship. He was the leading citizen of his country. And I think one of the most valuable things with More is here, getting to know him, studying his life and writings. Here is a way to become great leading citizens again, with virtue like More's, with integrity like More's, with good conscience, good humor, with hope like Thomas More's.
Well, we're going to have to stop there. My guest has been Stephen Smith, author of The Last Riddle. Please procure a copy of this. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.